Persepolis breathes no more. Once, its stones gleamed beneath the Persian sun, and its walls shimmered with polished limestone. Now, only the wind moves between fractured columns and shattered gates. The throne city of the Achaemenid Empire once dazzled the world, a symbol of divine kingship, where Darius the Great commanded vast armies with a flick of the hand, and Xerxes held court beneath gilded ceilings. But empires, like men, are dust-bound. Most remember the names carved deep into their foundations. Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, kings whose deeds were pressed into clay and sung across borders. But there was another whose name lies buried in silence. Sogdianus. He ruled not by inheritance, but by circumstance, not by ceremony, but by swift bloodshed. And though he wore the crown, he never received a proper coronation, because his time on the throne lasted mere months, and even that is debated. Why then remember him at all? Because his reign is a window into a forgotten succession war, a moment of chaos within an empire believed to be orderly, a brief reign where ambition met betrayal and was snuffed out before it began. The year is 424 BCE. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley. But at its heart, the throne is about to crack. Artaxerxes I, son of Xerxes, has died, likely poisoned. He leaves behind at least 18 sons and no clear successor. The official heir is Xerxes II, the only legitimate son. He is crowned and rules from Persepolis, but his reign lasted just 45 days. One night, as he bathes, the assassins enter. They are sent by his half-brother, Sogdianus. And with Xerxes' murder, the empire enters its darkest interregnum. Sogdianus is not the strongest contender. He is the son of Artaxerxes by a concubine, not a queen. He lacks the support of noble houses, but he moves quickly, seizing Babylon and declaring himself king before anyone can stop him. He offers bribes. He sends letters. He tries desperately to be recognized as legitimate. But in the east, a third brother rises. His name is Ochus, a satrap of Hyrcania, a seasoned military commander. Unlike Sogdianus, Ochus commands real loyalty, especially from the army and court elites. He proclaims himself King of Kings and takes a throne name, Darius II. The empire cannot hold 3 kings. Each brother claims descent. Each has supporters, but only one will live. In Babylon, Sogdianus clings to power. He executes suspected traitors. He sends lavish gifts to noble families. He builds statues in his name, most of which would later be torn down. But his efforts are in vain. His court is paranoid. His rule, brittle. Ochus marches west with his army. Sogdianus tries to bargain. He offers recognition in exchange for rule over Babylon. Ochus pretends to consider, then arrests him at their first meeting. The execution is not swift. Ochus declares that Sogdianus shall not die by sword, poison, or hanging, but by ash. He is buried alive in a heap of hot cinders, a cruel, ceremonial punishment. Some say it took hours. Some say he screamed. Others say he said nothing. With Sogdianus's death, Ochus becomes Darius II, unchallenged ruler of Persia. The empire steadies for now, but the scribes leave little record of what came before. No royal funerary rites, no monuments, no mourning. Sogdianus becomes what all kings fear, a name forgotten, a face erased, a ruler struck from history. But here, in the ruins of Persepolis, something lingers, a whisper of a man who wore the crown, if only briefly, whose blood ran just as royal, whose ambition burned too bright and too fast. This is not a story of victory. It is a memory retrieved, a silence broken. The empire has moved on, but tonight we remember the king they chose to forget. The death of Artaxerxes did not come with thunder, no fire from the heavens, no final roar of the great Persian army. It came quietly, some say, by poison. Others, a lingering sickness masked by silence and ritual. In the palace of Susa, the King of Kings exhaled his last breath as incense drifted through the royal chamber. Artaxerxes reigned nearly 40 years, a time of both rebuilding and rot. He had survived the fall of his father, Xerxes, and guided Persia through storms of rebellion and diplomacy. But he left behind a kingdom bloated with heirs, no fewer than 18 sons, perhaps more. Some are born of queens, others of concubines. The blood of kings flowed in many, but legitimacy was not evenly poured. Among them stood 3 names that would shape the shadow war to come. Xerxes II, the only son born of a queen, the lawful heir, groomed in Persepolis under silken robes and strict tutors. Sogdianus, son of a Babylonian concubine, quiet, calculating, politically minded, yet widely dismissed. And Ochus, satrap of Hyrcania, born of another concubine, but commanding soldiers, steel, and loyalty. A warrior, not a courtier. The empire knew no smooth succession. Darius the Great once seized power through cunning and assassination. Xerxes' rise was bathed in blood. Now history is prepared to repeat itself again and again within a single year. Xerxes II was crowned swiftly, as tradition demanded. He rode through Persepolis with golden lions flanking his chariot, nobles tossing blossoms at his feet. He was mournful, dignified, and utterly unprepared. He would rule for only 45 days, because Sogdianus had already begun to move. In Babylon, word of Artaxerxes' death stirred quiet corridors. Sogdianus sent riders with bribes and promises. He gathered allies from among the priesthood, the satraps who resented Persepolis' dominance, and the nobles who had no seat at Xerxes II's table. He did not wear a crown, but he wove a net. And when Xerxes II stepped into the palace baths one cool evening, the trap closed. The assassins were discreet. No blades flashed in the open, only the stillness of water. Then the sudden silence of a body slipping beneath it. The robe of the king floated, unclaimed. The body was never shown. No public mourning followed. There were whispers that the assassination had been blessed by the gods, or perhaps excused by them. In the empire's quieter corners, it was treated as divine correction, not betrayal. Sogdianus claimed the throne before the capital could react. From Babylon, he declared himself King of Kings, legitimate by divine favor, not birth. His scribes penned letters across the empire, sealing each with an emblem few recognized. He offered tax forgiveness to some cities, promises of Persian purity to others. He spoke the language of ambition, cloaked in ritual. He commissioned new statues to be erected in his image, though many remained unfinished. In the temples of Babylon, ceremonies were held in his name, yet many priests prayed with unease. It was not the custom that troubled them, but the speed. Kings did not rise so fast without leaving corpses in their wake. And yet, even as Sogdianus secured Babylon, voices rose from the east. Ochus, he had not waited in silence. As satrap of Hyrcania, he commanded armies and held the loyalty of seasoned veterans. He named himself king not in a whisper, but in thunder. He took the throne named Darius II, invoking the memory of the empire's greatest organizer. He wore that name like armor, daring the court to deny his claim. Ochus did not bother with ritual letters. He sent generals. He did not offer bribes. He offered the blade. His first moves were strategic, solidifying control over Media and Parthia. He restored garrisons, distributed spoils, and made no mention of the other claimant. His messengers carried only one message: Darius II reigns. Submit, and you will be spared. Sogdianus held a fragile throne. His legitimacy rested on shadows, and those shadows began to flicker. One by one, cities offered allegiance to Ochus. Even distant provinces like Bactria hesitated to recognize Babylon's claim. In secret, Sogdianus tried to appeal to Egypt, even to the Greeks, promising trade rights, Persian leniency, and gold. But the Mediterranean winds carried no support. His paranoia deepened. In Babylon's inner sanctum, he purged counselors he once trusted. Accusations fell like ash. Treason, sabotage, disloyalty. Some were buried alive. Others were thrown into the flames. The air in the palace thickened not just with incense, but with fear. He rarely appeared in public. When he did, he was flanked by a dozen guards, and even the nobility were searched before entering his presence. The lavish banquets ceased. So too did the music. In its place came silence and suspicion. Ochus, meanwhile, made no proclamations. His march westward was methodical. He brought with him no priests, no oracles, only armor and men who obeyed. At each conquered city, he spared the walls but executed the garrisons. His message was clear. Persia would not splinter under weakness again. Even satraps who remained undecided watched Ochus's advance and turned their eyes from Babylon. A new king had already taken shape, not by vote, not by blood, but by the weight of marching feet. Sogdianus sent one final emissary, a parchment handwritten in cuneiform and Old Persian. It offered Ochus recognition in exchange for shared rule. Babylon for Sogdianus, the rest for Darius II. It arrived too late, or was ignored entirely. Ochus crossed the Tigris. His troops moved with divine efficiency. Babylon's outer defenses were held for a week. Then, on a rain-soaked morning, the gates opened. No battle, no siege. The army simply walked in. Sogdianus had been betrayed. The very guards who had sworn loyalty the day before stood aside without resistance. They found him not in armor, but in royal dress, seated on the throne, still wearing the headdress of kingship, as if refusing to acknowledge his fate. He rose when Ochus entered, but did not kneel. They say the two spoke in private for some time. What words passed between them, none have written. But Ochus had made a promise, not to kill Sogdianus with a sword, nor by poison, nor by rope. Instead, he buried him alive, in ashes. It was a ceremonial execution, both punishment and statement. The pit was deep. The coals are still hot. Sogdianus descended without sound. He did not scream. He did not curse. Only the silence remained. Ochus rose uncontested. His reign would be long and weary, marked by internal strife and declining Persian influence abroad. But his name would live in inscriptions, his face on coins. His victories, small though they were, are remembered. And Sogdianus? His statues were toppled, his letters burned, his records erased, his brief reign marked only by a pause between two greater kings. But every empire has a breath it cannot explain. Every lineage, a moment it would rather forget. Sogdianus was that breath, that moment. And in remembering him, we remember how fragile the crown truly is, not in its gold, but in its silence. The palace air in Babylon was dense with heat and incense. Courtiers stood silent, their eyes trained on the steps of the throne. There was no king to speak. Xerxes, too, was dead, murdered, not by foreign assassins or traitors from distant provinces, but by blood. His half-brother Sogdianus had ordered it. In the quiet after the murder, the halls echoed louder than they ever had. Sogdianus did not wait for the ceremony. He seized the throne with swiftness, not grace. His first acts as king were not proclamations of peace or vision. They were acts of survival. Guards were doubled, messengers dispatched. A new royal seal was forged before the blood had dried in the bedchamber of the slain. The court watched, uncertain. The priests performed the coronation rites with their heads lowered, their chants brittle. The people of Babylon lit no fires in celebration. There were no crowds in the streets, only whispers in the market, and quiet glances exchanged behind veils. Sogdianus had not been raised to rule. He was the son of Artaxerxes I, yes, but not through a queen. His mother had been a concubine. That alone marked him as lesser in the eyes of the court. His name had rarely been mentioned among the elite, his role in the empire more ornamental than influential. And yet, here he stood, crowned, but not embraced. In the early days of his reign, he moved quickly. He convened the high officials, forced oaths of loyalty, and replaced governors in suspect provinces. His eyes scanned every room he entered. He spoke in clipped phrases. He ate alone. The nobility tolerated him. The satraps nodded and returned to their territories, but none knelt with fervor. There were no hymns written in his honor. No scholars recited verses to mark his reign. The silence around his rule was unnatural. Far to the east, in Hyrcania, a rival stirred. Ochus, another son of Artaxerxes I, of legitimate birth, well liked by the army, and governor of the eastern provinces, had taken note. Unlike Sogdianus, Ochus had bided his time, gathered influence, and built trust with the military elite. He was quiet, methodical, and deeply aware of the moment. When word of Xerxes II's death reached him, he did not weep. He wrote no letters of condolence. Instead, he summoned his commanders and posed a single question: who would follow him if he claimed what his blood was? Not a man objected. In Babylon, the king continued to rule with suspicion. Each week brought new arrests. Confessions were forced by servants. Governors were executed on vague charges. An entire family of scribes disappeared overnight after one was caught copying a letter addressed to a cousin in Susa. Fear replaced ceremony. Anxiety replaced reverence. Despite this, Sogdianus made attempts to mimic legitimacy. He ordered festivals. The temples were stocked with offerings. Statues of past kings were restored, and his name was carved beneath theirs. But even the stone seemed reluctant to remember him. In the palace courtyard, he once addressed the assembled guards, promising glory and prosperity. They responded with silence. No cheer, no salute, just silence. It was a silence that would become the signature of his reign. Ochus, meanwhile, sent envoys to the satraps of Elam, Media, and Bactria. He did not demand loyalty. He offered stability. He positioned himself not as a usurper, but as a restorer. He would avenge the murder of Xerxes. He would restore the true line of the Achaemenids. It was not an ambition. He believed it was justice. Within months, his support grew. Slowly, provinces began withholding taxes from Babylon. Priests in distant cities ceased mentioning Sogdianus in their invocations. The temple of Anahita in Ecbatana removed his name from the donor rolls. In the empire, absence was often louder than dissent. By the 5th month of his reign, Sogdianus had begun to isolate himself. He trusted no one. He summoned astrologers daily, seeking omens in the stars. He insisted on tasting all the food in private. No one entered his chambers without being searched twice. In one chilling incident, a member of his guard was caught whispering in the hall. The man was flayed, and his skin was nailed to the gate. The message was clear: Sogdianus ruled through terror. But terror was not loyalty. Ochus began his march west. His forces were not large, but they were loyal. The satrap of Elam met him with troops. The nobles of Susa opened their gates. Resistance was minimal. Word traveled ahead of him: Ochus was coming not to conquer but to cleanse. Babylon grew cold, not in temperature, but in temperament. Markets thinned. Pilgrims stayed home. Priests began to avoid the palace. The great ziggurat stood tall, but unlit. In desperation, Sogdianus called a public assembly. He promised reform. He blamed the unrest on foreign enemies and disloyal governors. He swore before the gods that he was chosen, that his rule was ordained. But the crowd did not cheer. They listened. Then they left, one by one. When Ochus reached the outer provinces near Babylon, he found no resistance. The gates of Sippar opened at dawn. The garrison at Opis disbanded without a fight. Only in Babylon itself did Sogdianus hope for loyalty. Inside the city, he fortified the palace. He poured silver into bribes. He offered land to mercenaries. He even reached out to Greek city-states for assistance, offering alliances in exchange for hoplites. The replies were few, non-favorable. Ochus did not attack. He surrounded. He waited. Inside the walls, food began to dwindle. The palace, once bustling with musicians and ministers, now echoed with the sounds of empty halls and sleepless guards. One evening, the high priest of Marduk was summoned. Sogdianus demanded a blessing, a ritual for protection. The priest offered none. He said the gods were silent. The king struck him. The priest did not flinch. He did not return. The end came not with swords or arrows. It came with doors. A general named Arbarius, who had long served under Sogdianus, opened the city gates at night. No battle, no siege. Babylon fell as silently as it had lived under Sogdianus's rule. Ochus entered with reverence. He ordered no pillaging. He declared no vengeance. He summoned the court and offered clemency to those who pledged loyalty. Many did so before the day ended. Sogdianus was captured. He did not beg. He did not speak. He simply stared at the floor as Ochus passed judgment. The sentence was symbolic. Death not by blade, not by hanging, but by ash. The punishment was rarely used, only for those who had betrayed royal blood. A tower was filled with ashes. Sogdianus was lowered inside, slowly, quietly. No screams, just silence, as he had ruled. Ochus ascended the throne as Darius II. His first decree was to erase Sogdianus from all records. Coins melted. The tablets were scraped clean. Statues altered. But the memory lingered. In whispered stories. In the way people hesitated when speaking of that year. In the silence that seemed to cling to the air even long after. Sogdianus ruled for just a few months. But in that time, he showed the world what a king without loyalty looked like, what power without purpose could become. And though history tried to forget him, memory had other plans. The morning after Sogdianus claimed the throne, the sun rose over Babylon with unusual hesitation. The city's merchants, accustomed to the rhythms of empire, noticed the change immediately. Guards stood differently at their posts. Scribes whispered, rather than proclaimed. Even the sacred fires in the temple of Marduk seemed to flicker with uncertainty, as if the gods themselves questioned what had transpired in the palace halls. Sogdianus understood the weight of his actions, though he would never admit it aloud. The murder of Xerxes II had been necessary, he told himself. But necessity and legitimacy were different creatures entirely. In the privacy of his newly claimed chambers, he studied the royal regalia with the intensity of a scholar examining foreign texts. The crown of Cyrus the Great felt heavier than gold should feel. The scepter of Darius seemed to resist his grip. These were not merely objects of power, they were symbols that had been worn by men who commanded the loyalty of millions without question. Sogdianus had no such luxury. Every morning brought fresh challenges to his authority. Reports arrived from provincial governors, their language carefully neutral, but their meaning clear. The satrap of Carmania had delayed his tribute payments. The governor of Gedrosia requested clarification on tax collection procedures. The ruler of Sogdiana's ancestral region had fallen mysteriously silent. Each message was a small rebellion wrapped in diplomatic courtesy. The new king responded with the tools. He dispatched royal messengers bearing threats disguised as reminders. He offered bonuses to provincial administrators who demonstrated unwavering loyalty. He commissioned new coins bearing his image, though the die makers seemed to struggle with capturing his likeness. The profile they created was stern but somehow unconvincing, as if the metal itself rejected the impression. In the throne room of Babylon, Sogdianus held court with increasing paranoia. He had inherited his father's advisors but trusted none of them. Ctesias, the court physician, attended to him daily but spoke only when spoken to Megabyzus. The aging general who had served 3 kings offered military counsel with visible reluctance. The high priest of Ahura Mazda performed the daily rituals, but his prayers seemed hollow, mechanical, rather than reverent. The king's sleep became fitful. Palace servants reported hearing him walking in the corridors at night, his footsteps echoing through empty halls. He would pause at windows, staring out at the city below, perhaps wondering how many of his subjects prayed for his downfall. During one such midnight wandering, he encountered a young scribe working late in the archive chamber. The boy looked up with terror when the king entered, parchment scattered across his desk. "What are you copying?" Sogdianus demanded, his voice sharp in the silence. The scribe's hands trembled as he gestured to the documents. "Tax records from Susa, your majesty. The quarterly assessments from the satrap of Elam." Sogdianus examined the papers, searching for hidden meaning in routine numbers. Finding none, he studied the boy's face instead. Fear was honest, at least. It was more reliable than the carefully composed expressions of his nobles. "Continue your work," he said finally. "But remember, the king sees everything, even in darkness." The scribe nodded frantically, and Sogdianus departed, leaving the young man to work in trembling silence. It was a small display of power, meaningless in the greater scheme of empire, but it provided momentary comfort. In a world where loyalty was scarce, fear would have to suffice. Meanwhile, in the eastern provinces, Ochus had begun his campaign of legitimacy. Unlike his half-brother, he possessed advantages that could not be bought or threatened out of existence. His mother had been a noblewoman of Hyrcania, not a concubine. His appointment as a satrap had been earned through competence, not favoritism. Most importantly, he commanded the respect of the military elitemen who understood that empires were built on steel, not ceremony. The contrast between the two brothers was stark. While Sogdianus isolated himself in Babylon's palace, Ochus made himself visible throughout his domain. He visited garrison commanders personally, sharing meals with common soldiers and listening to their concerns. He consulted with local governors, not to threaten them but to understand their challenges. He attended religious ceremonies with genuine reverence, not as a form of political theatre. When news of Xerxes II's assassination reached Hyrcania, Ochus did not rush to judgment. He convened a council of trusted advisors and posed a careful question. If the empire requires new leadership, what would that leadership look like? The discussion that followed was remarkable for its honesty. General Artaphernes, a veteran of campaigns in Scythia, spoke bluntly. The army needs a king who understands warfare, not court politics. Sogdianus has never led troops in battle. He has never seen the face of an enemy or felt the weight of command decisions. Satrap Gobryas of Media added his perspective. The provinces need stability, not paranoia. A king who rules through fear creates enemies where none existed before. Sogdianus has already begun this process. The high priest of Ahura Mazda in Ecbatana, Ostanes, offered perhaps the most crucial insight. The gods judge kings by their actions, not their bloodlines. A usurper who brings peace and prosperity is more blessed than a legitimate ruler who brings chaos and suffering. These conversations took place over several days, not as conspiracies but as honest assessments of the empire's needs. Ochus listened more than he spoke, weighing each perspective carefully. When the discussions concluded, he had reached a decision that would reshape the Persian world. "I will not rebel against legitimate authority," he announced. "But I will not stand idle while the empire fragments under illegitimate rule. If the gods will it, I will accept the burden of kingship. But I will not seize it. I will let it come to me." This distinction was crucial. Ochus positioned himself not as a usurper but as a reluctant savior. He would not attack Sogdianus directly, but he would make himself available as an alternative. The strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Let Sogdianus destroy himself through his incompetence, then step forward to restore order. The plan began to unfold with careful precision. Ochus sent envoys to neighboring satraps, not to demand their allegiance, but to gauge their concerns. The messages were consistent. The empire was in crisis, and solutions were needed. He offered no threats, made no demands, but simply reminded his peers that stability was preferable to chaos. The responses revealed the depth of Sogdianus's problems. The satrap of Aria reported increased bandit activity along trade routes, suggesting weakened central authority. The governor of Bactria mentioned delays in receiving official communications from Babylon. The ruler of Sogdian, ironically, the region that bore the usurper's name, expressed concerns about tax collection and military recruitment. These were not direct challenges to Sogdianus's authority, but they painted a picture of an empire losing cohesion. Provincial administrators were hedging their bets, maintaining minimal compliance while preparing for potential leadership changes. The machinery of government continued to function, but with decreasing efficiency and enthusiasm. In Babylon, Sogdianus felt the pressure mounting. Reports from his spy network painted an increasingly troubling picture. Ochus was gaining influence without appearing to seek it. His name was mentioned with respect in military circles. Provincial governors spoke of him with admiration. Even merchants in the bazaars seemed to regard him favorably. The king's response was characteristically heavy-handed. He increased the surveillance of his officials, looking for signs of disloyalty. He demanded more frequent reports from provincial governors, creating administrative burdens that further strained the system. He began to purge court officials based on rumors and suspicions, removing experienced administrators and replacing them with men whose only qualification was recent appointment. One particularly tragic example was the fate of Datams, the royal treasurer. The man had served faithfully under Artaxerxes I and had initially pledged loyalty to Sogdianus. However, when he suggested that certain provincial tax increases might be counterproductive, The king interpreted this as subtle defiance. Datums was arrested, tortured until he confessed to imaginary crimes, and then executed in the palace courtyard. His death served as a warning to other officials, but it also demonstrated the paranoid atmosphere that now surrounded the throne. The treasurer's execution had unexpected consequences. His family fled to Susa, where they found refuge with relatives who had connections to the court of Ochus. Their testimony about conditions in Babylon provided valuable intelligence about Sogdianus's mental state and administrative failures. More importantly, their presence in Ochus's territory served as a symbol of the growing refugee crisis created by the usurper's purges. As autumn approached, the contrast between the two rival courts became increasingly pronounced. Babylon had become a city of whispers and fear, where even long-time residents avoided unnecessary contact with palace officials. The great markets still functioned, but with diminished enthusiasm. Religious festivals continued, but with smaller crowds and less elaborate ceremonies. The city's cultural life, once vibrant and cosmopolitan, had been muted by the atmosphere of suspicion and violence. Hyrcania, meanwhile, had become a beacon of stability. Ochus maintained his administrative duties with quiet competence, ensuring that taxes were collected fairly and that trade routes remained secure. His court attracted visitors from across the eastern provinces, men seeking refuge from the chaos spreading westward. He welcomed them with courtesy but without fanfare, allowing words of his hospitality to spread naturally. The psychological warfare between the two brothers was subtle but effective. Sogdianus represented the old model of Persian kingship, absolute authority backed by fear and tradition. Ochus embodied a newer approach, competent leadership earning respect through results. The empire was being forced to choose between these competing visions of royal power. The choice became clearer as winter approached. Sogdianus had survived his first months as king, but survival was not the same as success. His reign had been marked by purges, paranoia, and provincial alienation. He had worn the crown, but he had not earned it. The empire was learning to function despite his leadership, not because of it. In the eastern provinces, Ochus continued his patient campaign of legitimacy. He had not declared himself king, but he had positioned himself as the obvious alternative when the current arrangement inevitably collapsed. His strategy was working because it was based on a fundamental truth. Empires needed effective leadership more than they needed traditional legitimacy. The stage was set for the final act of this fraternal drama. Sogdianus had seized power through violence and maintained it through fear. Ochus had built support through competence and maintained it through patience. One brother represented the worst aspects of royal ambition. The other embodied the best qualities of imperial leadership. The gods, it seemed, were preparing to render their judgment. And in the pantheon of Persian deities, competence was valued more highly than convenience. The empire would soon learn which brother truly deserved to wear the crown of Cyrus the Great. Winter in Babylon brought more than cold winds and shortened days. It brought the weight of realization to a king who had never been prepared for the burdens of absolute power. Sogdianus sat in the throne room as frost formed on the palace windows, studying dispatches that painted an increasingly grim picture of his empire's condition. The documents were written in the careful language of bureaucracy, but their meaning was clear. His authority was crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to the desert sun. The satrap of Sagatia had submitted his quarterly report 3 weeks late, with a notation that administrative delays had prevented timely submission. The governor of Carmania had requested additional military support to deal with increased bandit activity, though intelligence suggested the bandits were refugees fleeing Sogdianus's purges. Most troubling of all, the high priest of Persepolis had sent word that the sacred fires were burning low, requiring additional fuel and resources to maintain their eternal flame. These were not mere administrative inconveniences. They were symptoms of a deeper malaise that threatened the very foundations of Achaemenid rule. The empire functioned on the principle of reciprocal obligation. The king provided protection and stability, while his subjects provided loyalty and tribute. When that balance was disrupted, the entire system began to collapse. Sogdianus understood this intellectually, but he lacked the experience and temperament necessary to address it effectively. His solution to every problem was the same: more control, more surveillance, more punishment. He had inherited a sophisticated administrative system that had evolved over 2 centuries, but he was attempting to rule it like a small provincial garrison. The results were predictably disastrous. The king's daily routine had become a ritual of paranoia. He rose before dawn and immediately summoned his intelligence officers for briefings about potential threats. He ate breakfast alone, with food tasters sampling every dish multiple times. He held court for precisely 1 hour each morning, listening to petitions and complaints with visible impatience. The remainder of his day was spent reviewing reports, planning security measures, and conducting interrogations of suspected traitors. Even his physical appearance reflected the strain of his position. Court observers noted that he had lost weight, his royal robes hanging loose on his frame. His hair, once carefully maintained according to Persian custom, now showed streaks of premature grey. His eyes, always sharp and calculating, had developed a haunted quality that made even his most loyal servants uncomfortable. The palace staff had learned to navigate this dangerous environment with extreme caution. Servants spoke in whispers when they spoke at all. Guards maintained rigid attention, even when off-duty. Even the court musicians, once known for their elaborate performances, now played simple melodies that were unlikely to be misinterpreted as coded messages. This atmosphere of fear had practical consequences for governance. Officials were reluctant to bring bad news, leading to delayed and filtered reports. Provincial administrators avoided requesting resources, fearing that their requests would be seen as criticism of royal policy. Military commanders hesitated to report enemy movements, knowing that failure to prevent raids could result in execution. The result was an empire that appeared stable on the surface, but was losing cohesion at an alarming rate. Trade routes became less secure as local governors struggled with inadequate resources. Tax collection became erratic as officials attempted to avoid drawing attention to their regions. Religious observances continued, but with less enthusiasm and community participation. In the eastern provinces, Ochus observed these developments with the careful attention of a seasoned administrator. His intelligence network comprised not spies but ordinary merchants, travelers, and officials who provided detailed reports about conditions throughout the empire. The picture they painted was one of systemic decay masked by bureaucratic routine. Unlike his half-brother, Ochus understood that information was most valuable when it was accurate rather than comforting. His daily briefings included honest assessments of problems and challenges, not just reports of success and compliance. This approach allowed him to make informed decisions about resource allocation and strategic priorities. The contrast in leadership styles was evident in how each brother handled a typical provincial crisis. When reports reached Babylon about increased Scythian raids across the northern frontier, Sogdianus's response was to demand explanations from local commanders and threaten punishment for failure to maintain security. When the same reports reached Hyrcania, Ochus's response was to analyze the raiders' patterns, assess available resources, and coordinate with neighboring provinces to develop effective countermeasures. This difference in approach yielded dramatically different results. The northern provinces under Sogdianus's nominal control experienced continued raids and declining morale among frontier troops. The eastern provinces under Ochus's actual control successfully repelled similar attacks and maintained stable borders. Word of these successes spread throughout the empire, enhancing Ochus's reputation for competent leadership. The psychological impact of these contrasting outcomes was profound. Military commanders throughout the empire began to look eastward for inspiration and guidance. Provincial governors found themselves comparing their local situations to conditions in Hyrcania. Even court officials in Babylon quietly discussed the differences between the two brothers' administrative approaches. Sogdianus was not oblivious to these comparisons, but his response was characteristically counterproductive. Rather than examining his failures and attempting to improve, he focused on undermining his rival's successes. He sent agents to spread rumors about Ochus's loyalty to legitimate authority. He attempted to bribe provincial officials to report unfavorably about conditions in the eastern provinces. He even considered military action against his half-brother, though his advisors convinced him that such a move would be premature and potentially catastrophic. The king's growing obsession with Ochus revealed another crucial weakness in his character: the inability to distinguish between personal rivalry and state interests. A competent ruler would have recognized that his half-brother's success in maintaining provincial stability was beneficial to the empire. Sogdianus saw only a threat to his position and reacted accordingly. This narrow focus on personal power had severe consequences for his ability to govern effectively. He spent increasing amounts of time and resources on intelligence gathering about Ochus rather than addressing the empire's actual problems. He appointed officials based on their willingness to spy on potential rivals rather than their administrative competence. He made policy decisions based on their impact on his security rather than their benefit to the state. The winter months provided a natural pause in military and administrative activities, allowing both brothers to consolidate their positions and plan for the coming year. Sogdianus used this time to strengthen his control over the western provinces, particularly Babylonia and Mesopotamia. He replaced several governors with men whose loyalty was guaranteed by their complete dependence on royal favor. He increased garrison sizes in major cities, ostensibly to maintain order, but to intimidate potential opponents. Ochus used the same period more constructively, focusing on improving administrative efficiency and building stronger relationships with local leaders. He established new trade agreements that benefited both provincial economies and imperial revenues. He mediated disputes between different ethnic and religious groups, strengthening social cohesion in his territories. He even initiated public works projects that provided employment and demonstrated the benefits of stable governance. These different approaches to winter governance reflected fundamental differences in how each brother understood the nature of royal power. Sogdianus viewed kingship as a zero-sum competition where his gains necessarily came at others' expense. Ochus understood that effective leadership created value for everyone, making the pie larger rather than simply claiming a bigger slice. The philosophical implications of this difference were profound. Sogdianus represented the traditional model of Persian kingship, where the monarch's will was absolute and opposition was crushed without mercy. This approach had worked for previous rulers like Darius the Great and Xerxes, but it required a level of competence and charisma that Sogdianus simply did not possess. Ochus embodied a more sophisticated understanding of leadership, one that recognized the importance of consent and collaboration in effective governance. He had learned from observing his father's long reign that sustainable power required more than fear and tradition. It required the ability to inspire loyalty through competence, and to build coalitions through mutual benefit. As winter gave way to spring, the contrast between these two models of kingship became increasingly apparent to observers throughout the empire. Sogdianus's territories were characterized by fear, inefficiency, and declining morale. Ochus's provinces demonstrated stability, prosperity, and growing confidence. The empire was conducting a real-time experiment in governance, and the results were becoming impossible to ignore. The stage was set for the final confrontation between the two brothers. Sogdianus had worn the crown for nearly a year, but he had not earned the right to keep it. Ochus had built the foundations of legitimate authority, but he had not yet claimed the throne that his competence deserved. The empire watched and waited, knowing that the current situation could not continue indefinitely. The gods of Persia, it seemed, were preparing to choose between two very different visions of royal power. The outcome would determine not just who wore the crown, but what kind of kingdom would emerge from the chaos of succession. The forgotten king's reign was approaching its inevitable conclusion, but the lessons of his failure would resonate through Persian history for generations to come. Spring arrived in Babylon with the promise of renewal, but for Sogdianus, it brought only fresh reminders of his precarious position. The great festival of Nowruz, celebrating the Persian New Year, should have been a time of celebration and imperial grandeur. Instead, it became a stark demonstration of how far his authority had eroded over the winter months. The traditional ceremonies required the presence of provincial governors and military commanders, who were expected to renew their oaths of loyalty to the King of Kings. In previous years, these gatherings had been magnificent displays of imperial unity, with hundreds of dignitaries traveling from across the empire to pay homage at the royal court. This year, the attendance was notably sparse. Of the 23 provincial governors, only 11 appeared in person. The others sent representatives or excuses, citing various emergencies and obligations that prevented their attendance. The satrap of Bactria claimed that recent floods had made travel impossible. The governor of Sogdiana reported that tribal uprisings required his immediate attention. The commander of the Egyptian garrisons sent word that Persian interests in the Nile Delta were under threat from Greek mercenaries. These explanations were plausible individually, but their cumulative effect was unmistakable. The empire's leadership was avoiding their king, and their absence spoke more loudly than any direct challenge could have done. Sogdianus sat on his throne during the abbreviated ceremonies, maintaining royal dignity while internally calculating the political implications of each empty seat. The governors who did attend were equally revealing in their behavior. They performed the required rituals with mechanical precision, offering the traditional gifts and reciting the ancient formulas of loyalty. But their eyes remained downcast, their voices lacked enthusiasm, and their departures were suspiciously prompt. They fulfilled their obligations to the letter while making it clear that their presence was dutiful rather than voluntary. Even more troubling were the reports that reached Babylon after the festival concluded. Several of the absent governors had been in communication with each other, coordinating their excuses and sharing intelligence about conditions throughout the empire. This was not yet open rebellion, but it represented a level of cooperation that bypassed royal authority entirely. The military situation was equally concerning. The Persian army had traditionally been organized around the principle of absolute loyalty to the king, with officers sworn to personal service rather than abstract concepts of state or nation. This system had worked effectively for centuries, but it depended on the king's ability to inspire genuine respect and devotion. Sogdianus possessed neither quality in sufficient measure. His interactions with military commanders were characterized by suspicion and micromanagement rather than trust and delegation. He demanded detailed reports about troop movements and garrison activities, not to improve strategic coordination but to monitor potential threats to his position. Officers found themselves spending more time on administrative compliance than on actual military duties. The impact on military effectiveness was predictable. Frontier defenses became less responsive to enemy movements because commanders feared making decisions without explicit royal approval. Training exercises were reduced because large gatherings of armed men made the king nervous. Even routine maintenance of weapons and equipment suffered as military budgets were diverted to intelligence gathering and palace security. These problems were compounded by Sogdianus's interference in military appointments. Traditional Persian practice allowed commanders to select their subordinates based on merit and proven loyalty. The king overruled these decisions, promoting officers whose primary qualification was their willingness to spy on their colleagues. The result was a command structure riddled with incompetence and internal conflict. The consequences of this military degradation were soon evident on the empire's borders. Scythian raiders, previously deterred by the reputation of Persian military efficiency, began testing frontier defenses with increasing boldness. Greek mercenaries found employment with local rulers who sensed weakness in imperial authority. Even traditionally loyal client kingdoms began to hedge their bets, reducing their tribute payments and strengthening their military forces. Reports of these developments reached Babylon in a steady stream throughout the spring months. Each dispatch painted a picture of declining imperial prestige and growing external threats. A competent ruler would have responded by addressing the underlying causes of military weakness. Sogdianus reacted by increasing surveillance of his commanders and demanding more detailed reports about their activities. The economic implications of political instability were equally serious. The Persian Empire's prosperity depended on extensive trade networks that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia and India. These networks functioned effectively only when merchants could rely on stable political conditions and consistent legal frameworks. Sogdianus's paranoid governance style disrupted both requirements. Merchants traveling through his territories faced unpredictable delays as officials conducted security inspections. Trade agreements were cancelled or renegotiated based on the king's suspicions about particular regions or ethnic groups. Even the standardized weights and measures that facilitated commerce were subject to arbitrary changes as local administrators attempted to demonstrate their loyalty through bureaucratic innovation. The decline in trade revenues created a fiscal crisis that further weakened the empire's foundations. Traditional sources of income, taxes, tribute, and customs duty sol decreased as economic activity slowed. The king's response was to increase tax rates and impose new levies, creating a vicious cycle that further discouraged commercial activity. Provincial governors found themselves caught between impossible demands. They were expected to maintain order with reduced resources, while simultaneously increasing their contributions to the royal treasury. Many responded by adopting harsh measures against their populations, creating resentment that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The religious dimension of Sogdianus's failures was particularly significant in Persian culture. The Achaemenid kings had traditionally maintained their authority through divine sanction, presenting themselves as chosen representatives of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism. This religious legitimacy was crucial because it provided a moral foundation for political obedience. Sogdianus's method of gaining the throne fratricide violated fundamental Zoroastrian principles about the sanctity of family bonds and the importance of truth in human relationships. The fact that he had murdered his half-brother through deception rather than open combat made the crime even more offensive to religious sensibilities. The Zoroastrian priesthood found itself in an impossible position. They could not openly condemn the king without risking persecution, but they also could not enthusiastically support a ruler whose actions contradicted their religion's core teachings. Their solution was a form of passive resistance that undermined Sogdianus's religious authority without providing grounds for retaliation. Prayers for the king's health and prosperity became perfunctory rather than heartfelt. Religious festivals were observed with minimal ceremony rather than elaborate celebration. The sacred fires that symbolized divine approval were maintained but not enhanced. The priesthood fulfilled its obligations while making it clear that divine favor was not automatically granted to those who seized power through violence. This religious skepticism had profound psychological effects on the general population. The Persian people had been taught to view their kings as sacred figures whose authority derived from divine approval. When the priesthood's enthusiasm for the current ruler was constrained, it created doubts about his legitimacy that spread throughout society. The cumulative effect of these political, military, economic, and religious failures was a crisis of confidence that extended far beyond Sogdianus's position. The empire itself was beginning to question the principles that had guided its development for 2 centuries. Traditional assumptions about royal authority, administrative efficiency, and imperial destiny were all being challenged by the reality of incompetent leadership. In the eastern provinces, Ochus observed these developments with the analytical detachment of a scholar studying a historical case study. His intelligence network provided detailed reports about conditions throughout the empire, allowing him to understand not just what was happening, but why it was happening. This comprehensive perspective gave him crucial advantages in planning his response to the crisis. Unlike his half-brother, Ochus understood that the empire's problems were systemic rather than personal. Sogdianus's failures were symptoms of deeper weaknesses in the imperial system, weaknesses that would require fundamental reforms rather than cosmetic changes. Any successor would need to address these underlying issues if they hoped to restore stability and prosperity. The challenge was immense. The empire was not just experiencing political instability, but was facing a crisis of legitimacy that threatened its very foundations. The next king would need to rebuild not just administrative efficiency, but also popular confidence in the imperial system itself. This would require not just competent governance, but also symbolic actions that demonstrated a genuine commitment to the empire's welfare. Ochus began to position himself as the leader who could meet these challenges. His reputation for competent administration was well established, but he also needed to demonstrate his commitment to the empire's traditional values while showing his ability to adapt to changing circumstances. This required a careful balance between continuity and innovation, between respect for tradition and responsiveness to new realities. The stage was set for the final act of the succession crisis. Sogdianus had proven his inability to govern effectively, but he still controlled the imperial capital and the traditional symbols of royal authority. Ochus had built the foundations of legitimate leadership, but he had not yet claimed the throne that his competence deserved. The empire waited for someone to resolve the contradiction between formal authority and actual legitimacy. The gods of Persia, it seemed, were preparing to render their final judgment on the forgotten king's reign. The outcome would determine not just the next occupant of the throne, but the future direction of the empire itself. The lessons learned from Sogdianus's failure would influence Persian governance for generations to come, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition unchecked by competence. In the mountain passes of Hyrcania, where the Caspian winds carried the scent of pine and the promise of change, Ochus made his final preparations for the confrontation that would determine the empire's future. The spring of 423 BCE had brought more than seasonal renewal. It had brought the moment when patience would transform into action, when careful planning would yield to decisive movement. The decision to march on Babylon had not been made lightly. For months, Ochus had resisted the urgings of his supporters, who grew increasingly frustrated with Sogdianus's incompetent rule. Military commanders offered their troops. Provincial governors pledged their territories. Even merchants and priests sent messages of support, begging him to end the crisis that was destroying the empire's stability. But Ochus understood that timing was crucial in political affairs. A premature move would have branded him as merely another ambitious pretender, no different from his half-brother. The key was to wait until the empire itself demanded change, until his intervention would be seen as salvation rather than usurpation. That moment had finally arrived. The spring dispatches from across the empire painted a picture of systemic collapse that could no longer be ignored. The northern frontiers were under constant pressure from Scythian raiders. The western provinces were experiencing widespread civil unrest. The eastern territories were questioning their loyalty to a distant king who seemed indifferent to their welfare. Most significantly, the empire's traditional supporters were beginning to abandon their posts. The governor of Carmania had simply disappeared, leaving his province without central authority. The satrap of Aria had been assassinated by his guards, apparently in response to orders from Babylon to increase tax collection. The high priest of Persepolis had sent word that the sacred fires were in danger of being extinguished due to a lack of resources. These were not ordinary administrative challenges, they were symptoms of imperial collapse. The empire that had dominated the ancient world for 2 centuries was disintegrating under the weight of incompetent leadership. Something had to be done, and Ochus was the only leader with the capability and authority to do it. The decision to act was made during a council meeting held in the fortress of Zadrakata, the ancient capital of Hyrcania. The assembled officials represented the cream of Persian administrative and military talentmen who had served the empire faithfully for decades and who understood the gravity of the current crisis. General Artaphernes, the grey-haired veteran who had fought in campaigns from Scythia to Egypt, spoke for the military establishment. The army will not follow Sogdianus into battle. His paranoia has destroyed unit cohesion, and his interference has made effective command impossible. If we face external enemies under his leadership, we will suffer catastrophic defeats. Satrap Gobryas of Media represented the provincial administrators. The eastern provinces are ready to support legitimate authority, but they cannot survive much longer under current conditions. Trade has collapsed, tax collection is chaotic, and local populations are losing faith in imperial government. We need leadership that can restore order and prosperity. High Priest Ostanes articulated the religious dimension. The gods have withdrawn their favor from the current ruler. The signs are unmistakable natural disasters, military defeats, popular unrest. Divine justice demands that legitimate authority be restored before the empire suffers irreparable damage. The discussion continued for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. Ochus would march on Babylon, not as a rebel but as a restorer of legitimate governance. The campaign would be conducted with honor and discipline, demonstrating the qualities that had been absent from imperial leadership for too long. The preparations for the march revealed the fundamental differences between Ochus and his half-brother. While Sogdianus had built his power through fear and intimidation, Ochus relied on voluntary cooperation and mutual respect. His army was composed of soldiers who genuinely believed in their cause, not men who fought only to avoid punishment. The logistical arrangements were equally impressive. Provincial governors along the route offered supplies and support without being asked. Local populations provided guides and intelligence about road conditions. Even merchants contributed resources, knowing that a successful regime change would restore the stability necessary for profitable trade. This widespread support was not accidental, it was the result of years of competent governance that had demonstrated Ochus's fitness for greater responsibilities. He had earned the loyalty of his supporters through consistent performance, not through bribes or threats. The empire was rallying to his cause because it recognized genuine leadership when it saw it. The march itself was a masterpiece of military organization. The army moved in disciplined formations, maintaining strict order and treating civilian populations with respect. No looting was permitted, and no unnecessary violence was tolerated. The soldiers understood that they were not conquerors but liberators, and they conducted themselves accordingly. News of the army's progress spread quickly throughout the empire. Sogdianus's intelligence network brought reports of the approaching force, but they also brought more disturbing news. Provincial governors were opening their gates to Ochus without resistance. Cities were welcoming his army with celebrations. The population was treating his advance as a liberation rather than an invasion. In Babylon, the atmosphere grew increasingly desperate. Sogdianus's remaining supporters recognized that their position was hopeless, but they also knew that defeat would likely mean death or exile. They had no choice but to fight, even though they had little hope of victory. The king's response to the approaching crisis revealed the depths of his character flaws. Rather than attempting to negotiate or seeking to address the legitimate grievances that had fueled the rebellion, he focused on identifying scapegoats and planning revenge against his enemies. His final months were marked by increasingly erratic behavior and cruel punishments that further alienated his remaining supporters. The siege of Babylon, when it finally came, was mercifully brief. The city's defenders understood that they were fighting for a lost cause, and their resistance was half-hearted at best. When General Arbarius opened the gates to Ochus's army, he was merely acknowledging a reality that everyone had already accepted. Sogdianus's reign was over. The final confrontation between the two brothers was a study in contrasts. Sogdianus, still wearing the royal regalia but surrounded by the ruins of his failed reign, represented the worst aspects of unchecked ambition. Ochus, travel-stained but dignified, embodied the competence and integrity that the empire desperately needed. The conversation between them, conducted in private, remains one of history's great mysteries. No record exists of what words were exchanged between the brothers in those final moments, but the outcome was never in doubt. Sogdianus had lost not just his throne, but his claim to legitimacy itself. The execution that followed was both symbolic and practical. Ochus chose the ancient punishment of burial in Asher fate, reserved for those who had betrayed the sacred bonds of family and kingship. It was a deliberate statement that some crimes were so heinous that ordinary death was insufficient punishment. The method itself was deeply symbolic in Persian culture. Ash represented the destruction of lies and the purification of truth. By consigning Sogdianus to this fate, Ochus was declaring that his brother's entire reign had been built on falsehood, and that only through complete obliteration could the empire be cleansed of its corruption. The execution was conducted with a religious ceremony, overseen by Zoroastrian priests who had traveled from Persepolis for the occasion. The ritual emphasized that this was not mere political revenge, but divine justice. The gods had rendered their judgment, and mortal authority was simply carrying out their will. As Sogdianus descended into the pit of hot ash, witnesses reported that he maintained his dignity to the end. He spoke no words of defiance or pleas for mercy. He simply accepted his fate with the same stubborn pride that had characterized his entire reign. In death, he finally displayed the royal bearing that had eluded him in life. The silence that followed was profound. The empire had been holding its breath for months, waiting for a resolution to the succession crisis. Now, finally, it could exhale. Ochus was king, legitimate and unchallenged. The period of chaos was over, and the work of restoration could begin. But even as the empire celebrated its deliverance, the memory of Sogdianus lingered. His brief reign had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the imperial system that would need to be addressed if future crises were to be avoided. The lessons of his failure would influence Persian governance for generations to come. The coronation of Ochus as Darius II took place in the Great Hall of Babylon, with all the ceremony that had been absent from his predecessor's hasty assumption of power. The assembled nobles, military commanders, and provincial governors, who had witnessed months of chaos and uncertainty, now participated in rituals that restored the empire's sense of continuity and legitimacy. The new king understood that symbolic gestures were crucial in establishing his authority. Unlike Sogdianus, who had seized power through violence and maintained it through fear, Darius II emphasized his connection to the empire's glorious past and his commitment to its future prosperity. The coronation ceremony deliberately invoked the memory of great Persian kings while promising a new era of competent governance. The crown of Cyrus the Great, which had rested uneasily on Sogdianus's head, now found its proper place. The scepter of Darius, which had seemed to resist the usurper's grasp, now felt natural in the hands of a ruler who had earned the right to wield it. The regalia itself seemed to approve of the change, as if the objects themselves possessed the wisdom to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate authority. The new king's first official acts were calculated to demonstrate the radical change in imperial governance. Where Sogdianus had begun his reign with purges and executions, Darius II proclaimed a general amnesty for all who had served under his predecessor. Where the usurper had governed through paranoia and surveillance, the new king emphasized transparency and consultation. Where his half-brother had isolated himself in the palace, Darius II made himself accessible to officials and subjects alike. The contrast was immediately apparent to those who served in the imperial administration. Court officials who had lived in fear for months suddenly found themselves encouraged to speak freely about policy matters. Provincial governors who had avoided communication with Babylon during Sogdianus's reign now received regular correspondence from a king who genuinely wanted to understand their challenges and concerns. The military response to the change in leadership was particularly dramatic. Officers who had served reluctantly under Sogdianus now demonstrated genuine enthusiasm for their new commander-in-chief. Troop morale, which had plummeted during the usurper's reign, recovered almost immediately. The army that had been on the verge of disintegration under incompetent leadership quickly regained its reputation for discipline and effectiveness. The economic recovery was equally impressive. Merchants who had avoided Persian territories during the succession crisis now returned to trade routes that had been disrupted for months. Provincial tax collection, which had become chaotic under Sogdianus's arbitrary demands, was reorganized according to rational principles that balanced imperial needs with local capabilities. The empire's finances, which had been strained by the usurper's paranoid expenditures, were placed on a sustainable foundation. But perhaps the most significant change was in the empire's religious life. The Zoroastrian priesthood, which had maintained reluctant silence during Sogdianus's reign, now openly celebrated the restoration of legitimate authority. The sacred fires that had burned low were rekindled with elaborate ceremony. Religious festivals that had been muted by fear and uncertainty were restored to their traditional grandeur. The theological implications of these changes were profound. In Zoroastrian thought, the struggle between good and evil was not merely a cosmic abstraction, but a practical reality that played out in human affairs. Sogdianus had represented the forces of darkness, deception, violence, and chaos. Darius II embodied the principles of light, truth, justice, and order. The triumph of legitimate authority over usurpation was thus seen as a victory of divine will over mortal ambition. This religious dimension of the succession crisis had lasting effects on Persian political culture. Future kings would be reminded that their authority derived not just from military strength or noble birth, but from their ability to embody the moral principles that justified royal power. The crown was not merely a symbol of political authority, but a sacred trust that required worthy behavior from those who wore it. The international response to the change in leadership was equally significant. Foreign powers that had begun to question Persian strength during Sogdianus's chaotic reign now recognized that the empire had regained its stability and effectiveness. Greek city-states that had been planning aggressive actions against Persian territories reconsidered their plans. Client kingdoms that had begun to assert greater independence renewed their pledges of loyalty. The restoration of imperial prestige was not automatic. It required careful diplomacy and occasional displays of military strength. But Darius II possessed the competence and authority necessary to conduct effective foreign policy. His reputation for honest dealing and reasonable negotiation made him a more effective diplomatic partner than his paranoid predecessor had ever been. The administrative reforms implemented by the new king addressed many of the systemic problems that had been exposed during the succession crisis. The intelligence network that had been used for internal surveillance under Sogdianus was refocused on external threats and genuine security concerns. The provincial administration, which had been corrupted by favoritism and fear, was reorganized according to merit and competence. These changes were not merely cosmetic. They represented fundamental improvements in how the empire functioned. The Persian administrative system, which had been strained to the breaking point by incompetent leadership, was restored to its traditional efficiency. The network of roads, postal services, and communication systems that connected the empire's vast territories was rebuilt and strengthened. The legal system, which had been compromised by arbitrary judgments and politically motivated prosecutions, was reformed to ensure that justice was administered according to established principles rather than royal whim. The traditional Persian emphasis on truth and fairness in legal proceedings was restored, rebuilding public confidence in imperial institutions. But even as the empire celebrated its recovery, the memory of Sogdianus's reign served as a cautionary reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. The forgotten king's brief time on the throne had demonstrated that the Persian system of government, for all its sophistication, was vulnerable to the personal failings of individual rulers. The lessons learned from this experience influenced Persian political thought for generations. Future kings would be educated about the importance of competent governance and the dangers of unchecked ambition. The nobility would be reminded that their loyalty should be to the empire's welfare rather than to particular individuals. The administrative class would understand that their duty was to serve the state's interests rather than to curry favor with whoever happened to wear the crown. The historiographical treatment of Sogdianus's reign reveals the complexity of Persian attitudes toward this period. Official court histories tended to minimize or omit references to the usurper's rule, treating it as an unfortunate aberration that was best forgotten. But private chronicles and religious texts preserved more detailed accounts, recognizing that the crisis had important lessons for future generations. This tension between official silence and private memory reflects the broader challenge of how societies deal with traumatic experiences. The Persian Empire wanted to move forward from the succession crisis, but it also needed to learn from the mistakes that had made such a crisis possible. The solution was a form of selective memory that acknowledged the lessons while minimizing the embarrassment. The physical reminders of Sogdianus's reign were systematically removed. Statues erected in his honor were destroyed or rededicated to other rulers. Coins bearing his image were recalled and melted down. Buildings and monuments associated with his rule were either demolished or modified to eliminate references to his name. But the psychological impact of his reign could not be erased so easily. The empire had experienced a profound crisis of confidence that would take years to fully overcome. The Persian people had learned that their kings were not infallible, that the empire's stability could not be taken for granted, and that competent governance required constant vigilance and effort. The long-term consequences of the succession crisis extended far beyond the immediate political changes. The empire's military strategy was modified to prevent future internal conflicts. The administrative system was strengthened to ensure continuity of government during transitions. The religious establishment was given a greater role in legitimizing royal authority and preventing usurpation. These institutional changes made the Persian Empire more resilient, but they also made it more complex and potentially more fragile. The systems designed to prevent another Sogdianus might also make it more difficult for legitimate reformers to implement necessary changes. The balance between stability and adaptability would remain a challenge for Persian rulers for centuries to come. The broader historical significance of Sogdianus's reign lies not in what he accomplished, but in what he revealed about the nature of political power in the ancient world. His failure demonstrated that authority based solely on force and fear was ultimately unsustainable. His overthrow showed that even absolute monarchies required some form of consent from the governed to function effectively. These lessons were not unique to the Persian Empire. They reflected universal truths about governance that would be rediscovered by later civilizations. The Forgotten King's brief reign thus serves as a case study in the dynamics of political legitimacy, the importance of competent leadership, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The palace of Babylon stood silent in the months following Darius II's coronation, its corridors slowly returning to the rhythms of normal governance after the paranoid chaos of Sogdianus's reign. But in the deepest chambers of the royal archives, scribes worked by lamplight to complete a task that would determine how history would remember the Forgotten King. They were systematically removing his name from official records, transforming him from a historical figure into a historical void. The process was thorough and methodical. Royal inscriptions were carefully modified, with Sogdianus's name chiseled away and replaced with decorative flourishes or the names of legitimate rulers. Tax records were recopied, omitting references to the usurper's brief period of authority. Military dispatches were edited to create the impression that Darius II had succeeded his father directly, without the intervening period of fraternal conflict. This deliberate erasure reflected a sophisticated understanding of how historical memory is constructed and maintained. The Persian court recognized that the legitimacy of the current ruler could be undermined by too much attention to the circumstances of his rise to power. By minimizing references to Sogdianus's reign, they were protecting not just the memory of the past, but the stability of the present. The task was complicated by the fact that Sogdianus had governed for several months, during which time he had made decisions that affected the empire's affairs. These decisions could not simply be ignored. They had created legal obligations, established precedents, and generated consequences that continued to influence events long after the usurper's death. The solution was a form of bureaucratic fiction that attributed Sogdianus's acts to other authorities. Tax assessments made during his reign were retroactively credited to provincial governors acting under emergency powers. Military appointments were reclassified as temporary field promotions that had always been subject to royal confirmation. Legal judgments were reinterpreted as the decisions of local magistrates rather than royal decrees. This systematic revision of the historical record was not merely an exercise in propaganda, it was a necessary step in restoring the empire's administrative coherence. The Persian governmental system depended on clear lines of authority and established procedures. The existence of a usurper's reign created ambiguities and contradictions that could undermine the legal foundations of imperial rule. The religious dimension of this erasure was equally important. In Zoroastrian thought, truth was not merely a moral principle but a cosmic force that shaped reality itself. The lies and deceptions that had characterized Sogdianus's rise to power were seen as violations of the natural order that needed to be corrected through deliberate acts of truth-telling. The priests who participated in this revision of history understood that they were not falsifying the past but purifying it. By removing references to the usurper's reign, they were restoring the truthful narrative of legitimate succession that had been temporarily obscured by Sogdianus's deceptions. The historical record was being corrected, not corrupted. This theological justification for historical revision reveals important aspects of Persian political culture. The empire's rulers were not just political leaders but sacred figures whose authority derived from divine sanction. Any challenge to their legitimacy was thus seen as both a political rebellion and a religious heresy that needed to be addressed at both levels. The practical challenges of erasing Sogdianus from history were immense. The Persian Empire was vast and bureaucratic, with thousands of officials and millions of subjects who had witnessed or participated in events during the usurper's reign. Complete erasure was impossible. Too many people had memories that could not be edited or destroyed. The solution was a form of selective amnesia that acknowledged the need for practical continuity while minimizing the symbolic importance of the disputed period. Officials who had served under Sogdianus were allowed to continue in their positions, but they were expected to avoid references to their former master. Citizens who had witnessed events during the usurper's reign were not punished for their knowledge, but they were discouraged from discussing their experiences publicly. This approach created a strange form of collective memory, in which everyone knew what had happened, but no one was supposed to talk about it. The succession crisis became an open secret, acknowledged in private but denied in public. The empire developed a form of institutional amnesia that allowed it to function normally while avoiding the complications that would arise from full historical honesty. The long-term consequences of this historical revision were profound. By minimizing the significance of Sogdianus's reign, the Persian court was also minimizing the lessons that could be learned from his failure. Future rulers would not have access to detailed accounts of how incompetent governance could lead to an imperial crisis. The empire would be less prepared to recognize and address similar problems in the future. This pattern of historical erasure was not unique to the Persian Empire, reflected a common tendency among ancient civilizations to suppress inconvenient truths about their past. But the Persian case was particularly systematic and thorough, creating a model for how unpopular rulers could be removed not just from power but from historical memory itself. The technique would be employed again during later periods of Persian history, whenever rulers needed to distance themselves from unpopular predecessors or controversial policies. The empire developed a sophisticated understanding of how historical narrative could be shaped to serve political purposes, creating a form of state-sponsored historical revision that was both subtle and effective. But the erasure of Sogdianus was never complete. References to his reign survived in private documents, foreign chronicles, and oral traditions that preserved memories the official historians wanted to forget. These fragmentary sources provide glimpses of the forgotten king's actual character and accomplishments, revealing aspects of his story that the official narrative omitted. The survival of these alternative accounts creates a complex historical puzzle. Scholars must navigate between the official silence and the unofficial memories, trying to reconstruct what happened during those crucial months of 423 BCE. The process is complicated by the fact that both the official and unofficial sources have their own biases and limitations. The official records, despite their systematic erasure of Sogdianus, provide valuable information about the empire's administrative and legal systems. They reveal how the Persian government functioned during periods of crisis and how it recovered from institutional disruption. They also demonstrate the sophisticated techniques used to maintain governmental continuity despite political upheaval. The unofficial sources, despite their fragmentary nature, provide insights into the human dimension of the succession crisis. They preserve stories about how ordinary people experienced the period of uncertainty and chaos. They reveal the emotional and psychological impact of living under a paranoid and incompetent ruler. They also provide glimpses of Sogdianus's personality and motivations that the official histories omit. The tension between these different types of evidence reflects broader questions about the nature of historical truth and the relationship between official and popular memory. The Persian Empire's attempt to erase Sogdianus from history was ultimately unsuccessful because historical memory is not entirely controlled by political authorities. People remember what they experience, regardless of what official sources tell them to forget. This resistance to historical revision had important political implications. The survival of memories about Sogdianus's reign created a form of institutional knowledge that could be drawn upon during future crises. Even though the official histories omitted references to the usurper, his story continued to circulate as a cautionary tale about the dangers of incompetent leadership. The gradual rediscovery of Sogdianus's story by later historians reveals how historical memory evolves. What was once a forbidden topic gradually became a subject of scholarly interest as political circumstances changed and new evidence became available. The forgotten king's story was eventually restored to its proper place in Persian history, though centuries had passed since his death. This process of historical recovery demonstrates the resilience of human memory and the ultimate futility of attempts to completely erase inconvenient truths. The Persian Empire's sophisticated efforts to remove Sogdianus from history were ultimately defeated by the simple fact that people remember what they experience, regardless of what authorities tell them to forget. The modern understanding of Sogdianus's reign thus represents a victory of historical truth over political expedience. By piecing together fragments of evidence from various sources, scholars have been able to reconstruct a reasonably complete picture of the forgotten king's brief time on the throne. His story serves as a reminder of the importance of preserving historical memory, even when that memory is politically inconvenient. The broader lessons of Sogdianus's reign extend beyond the specific circumstances of ancient Persia. His story illustrates universal themes about the nature of political power, the importance of competent governance, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. These lessons remain relevant for modern readers who face similar challenges in their political systems. The forgotten king's brief reign thus serves as more than just a historical curiosity. It provides valuable insights into the dynamics of political legitimacy and the factors that determine whether rulers succeed or fail. His story is a testament to the enduring power of historical memory and the ultimate victory of truth over attempts at systematic deception. In the decades following Darius II's consolidation of power, the Persian Empire experienced a period of relative stability that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the succession crisis. The new king proved to be a competent administrator who addressed many of the systemic problems that had been exposed during his half-brother's brief reign. Trade routes were secured, provincial administration was reformed, and the military was restored to its traditional effectiveness. But beneath this surface stability lay deeper currents of change that would ultimately reshape the empire's political culture. The succession crisis had revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Persian system of government that could not be addressed simply by replacing one ruler with another. The institutional reforms implemented by Darius II were necessary but not sufficient to prevent future crises of similar magnitude. The most significant change was in the relationship between the king and the imperial elite. Previous Persian rulers had relied on a combination of traditional authority and personal charisma to maintain their power. The nobility had accepted royal decisions not just because they were enforced by military strength, but because they believed in the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. Sogdianus's reign had shattered this unquestioning acceptance of royal authority. The imperial elite had witnessed firsthand how incompetent leadership could threaten the empire's survival. They had seen how quickly a legitimate ruler could be overthrown by an ambitious usurper. Most importantly, they had observed how the empire's traditional institutions had failed to prevent or quickly resolve the succession crisis. The result was a more skeptical and independent-minded nobility that was less willing to accept royal decisions without question. Provincial governors began to demand more detailed explanations of imperial policy. Military commanders insisted on greater autonomy in tactical decisions. Even court officials developed a tendency to question orders that seemed inconsistent with established procedures. This change in attitude was not necessarily negative. It created a system of checks and balances that made the empire more resilient and adaptable. But it also created new tensions between central authority and local autonomy that would persist throughout the remainder of the Achaemenid period. The balance between unity and diversity that had characterized the Persian Empire was permanently altered by the succession crisis. The military implications of these changes were particularly significant. The Persian army had traditionally been organized around the principle of absolute obedience to the king's commands. Officers were expected to carry out orders without question, regardless of their personal opinions about the wisdom of those orders. This system had worked effectively when the empire was ruled by competent kings who understood military affairs. Sogdianus's interference in military operations had demonstrated the dangers of this approach. His paranoid micromanagement had weakened the army's effectiveness and demoralized its officers. The experience had taught military leaders that blind obedience to royal authority could be counterproductive and potentially catastrophic. The response was a gradual evolution toward a more professional military culture that emphasized competence and expertise over political loyalty. Officers began to develop their own standards of professional conduct that were independent of royal preferences. Military doctrine was codified in written form to reduce the impact of arbitrary royal interference. The army gradually became more autonomous and self-regulating. This professionalization of the military was beneficial in many ways. It improved the empire's defensive capabilities and reduced the likelihood of military disasters caused by incompetent leadership. But it also created a potential challenge to royal authority that would become increasingly problematic in later periods. The tension between military professionalism and political control would remain a persistent theme in Persian governance. The economic consequences of the succession crisis were equally far-reaching. The disruption of trade routes and the uncertainty created by political instability had imposed significant costs on the empire's commercial activities. Merchants had learned that political stability could not be taken for granted, and that they needed to diversify their investments and develop contingency plans for future crises. The result was a more cautious and risk-averse approach to economic development that emphasized stability over rapid growth. The Persian Empire had traditionally benefited from its position as a bridge between the Mediterranean world and Central Asia. The succession crisis had demonstrated how quickly these advantages could be lost if the political system failed to maintain order. The response was a series of economic reforms designed to reduce the empire's vulnerability to political disruption. Trade agreements were renegotiated to include provisions for continued commerce during periods of political uncertainty. Commercial laws were codified to provide greater predictability for merchants and investors. The empire's financial system was reorganized to reduce dependence on royal decision-making. These changes made the Persian economy more resilient, but they also made it more complex and potentially more fragile. The systems designed to prevent economic disruption during political crises might also make it more difficult for the empire to respond quickly to new opportunities or challenges. The balance between stability and adaptability would remain a persistent challenge for Persian economic policy. The religious implications of the succession crisis were perhaps the most profound of all. The Zoroastrian priesthood had been forced to confront the possibility that the empire's traditional system of divine kingship might be fundamentally flawed. The fact that an incompetent usurper had been able to seize and maintain power for several months raised difficult questions about the relationship between political authority and divine sanction. The theological response was a gradual evolution toward a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between earthly and heavenly power. The priesthood began to emphasize that divine approval was not automatically granted to anyone who wore the crown, but had to be earned through righteous behavior and competent governance. The concept of divine kingship was not abandoned, but was refined to include moral and practical requirements. This theological development had important political implications. It provided a framework for evaluating royal performance that was independent of traditional concepts of legitimacy. It also created a potential basis for resistance to royal authority that was grounded in religious rather than political principles. The priesthood gradually developed a more independent role in Persian society that would become increasingly important in later periods. The cultural impact of the succession crisis was equally significant. The Persian Empire had traditionally celebrated the achievements of its rulers through elaborate ceremonies, monuments, and artistic works. The successful erasure of Sogdianus from official history had demonstrated the power of cultural institutions to shape collective memory and political identity. But the process of erasure had also revealed the limitations of cultural manipulation. The survival of alternative accounts in private documents and oral traditions showed that complete control of historical narrative was impossible. The empire's cultural elite had learned that they possessed significant power to influence political events through their control of information and interpretation. The result was a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between culture and politics that would influence Persian artistic and intellectual development for centuries. The empire's cultural institutions became more conscious of their political role and more strategic in their approach to historical commemoration. The balance between official ideology and popular memory would remain a persistent theme in Persian cultural life. The international consequences of the succession crisis were also significant. Foreign powers had observed the Persian Empire's vulnerability during the period of internal conflict and had drawn their conclusions about the empire's strengths and weaknesses. Some had begun to develop more aggressive policies toward Persian territories, while others had sought to exploit the empire's internal divisions for their advantage. The Persian response was a more sophisticated approach to international relations that emphasized the importance of maintaining both military strength and diplomatic flexibility. The empire could no longer rely solely on its reputation for invincibility to deter potential enemies. It needed to develop more nuanced strategies for dealing with the complex web of international relationships that had emerged during the succession crisis. The long-term implications of these changes would not become fully apparent for decades or even centuries. But the succession crisis had set in motion a series of developments that would ultimately transform the Persian Empire from a traditional monarchy based on personal authority into a more complex and institutionalized system of government. The forgotten king's brief reign had thus had consequences far beyond his failure. His incompetence had exposed systemic weaknesses in the empire's political structure that required fundamental reforms to address. His removal from power had demonstrated the importance of competent leadership and the dangers of unchecked ambition. His erasure from history had revealed the power and limitations of cultural manipulation in shaping political identity. The Persian Empire that emerged from the succession crisis was stronger and more resilient than the one that had entered it. But it was also more complex and potentially more fragile. The lessons learned from Sogdianus's failure would influence Persian governance for generations to come, serving as a constant reminder of the importance of competent leadership and the dangers of political complacency. The ultimate legacy of the forgotten king was not his brief time on the throne, but the changes his failure had forced upon the empire. His story serves as a testament to the unintended consequences of political action and the complex relationship between individual decisions and historical change. Even a ruler who was deliberately erased from history could have a profound impact on the course of events through the very act of his erasure. The sun sets over the ruins of Persepolis, as it has for millennia, casting long shadows across the broken columns and shattered reliefs that once proclaimed the glory of the Persian Empire. In the gathering dusk, the wind carries whispers of forgotten names and vanished dreams. among them the faint echo of a king who ruled for mere months, but whose story illuminates the eternal struggles of power, ambition, and human frailty. The great ceremonial stairway of Persepolis still bears the carved processions of tribute-bearers from across the empire, their stone faces frozen in expressions of reverence and submission. Each figure represents a different person, a different culture, a different corner of the vast Persian world. But nowhere among these eternal witnesses is there any trace of Sogdianus, the king who was deliberately erased from history, but whose brief reign revealed truths about the nature of power that the empire's greatest rulers would have preferred to forget. The archaeological evidence of his existence is fragmentary and disputed. A few coins bearing an unfamiliar royal profile, their provenance uncertain and their authenticity debated. Scattered references in private documents that survived the systematic purges of official records. Inconsistencies in royal chronologies suggest missing months in the imperial succession. The traces are there for those who know how to look, but they require careful interpretation and scholarly detective work to piece together. The most tantalizing evidence comes from the city of Babylon itself, where recent excavations have uncovered administrative documents that appear to date from the period of Sogdianus's reign. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, contain routine records of tax collection, legal proceedings, and commercial transactions. But they are dated according to the regnal years of a king whose name has been deliberately obscured, scratched out by ancient scribes who were following orders to erase all traces of the usurper's rule. The tablets reveal a government attempting to function normally, despite the political chaos surrounding it. Tax collectors continued their work, judges heard cases, and merchants conducted business. The machinery of imperial administration was so vast and complex that it could operate almost independently of whoever happened to wear the crown. This bureaucratic resilience was one of the Persian Empire's greatest strengths, but it also meant that incompetent rulers could cause significant damage before the system could correct itself. The human cost of Sogdianus's reign is harder to quantify but no less significant. The purges and executions that characterized his rule affected not just high officials but also their families, servants, and associates. Entire households disappeared overnight, their members killed or scattered to distant provinces. The climate of fear and suspicion that pervaded the court spread outward through the empire, affecting merchants, priests, and ordinary citizens who found themselves under suspicion for reasons they could not understand. The psychological impact of this period of terror was profound and lasting. The Persian people had been taught to revere their kings as divine representatives, chosen by Ahura Mazda to rule with wisdom and justice. The experience of living under a paranoid and incompetent ruler shattered this idealized image and created a more skeptical attitude toward royal authority that would persist for generations. The religious implications of Sogdianus's reign were equally significant. The Zoroastrian concept of divine kingship assumed that legitimate rulers would naturally embody the principles of truth, righteousness, and good governance. The existence of a king who violated these principles raised difficult theological questions about the relationship between earthly and heavenly authority. The priesthood's response was to develop a more sophisticated understanding of divine sanction that emphasized moral and practical requirements rather than automatic approval. This theological evolution had important political implications, creating a framework for evaluating royal performance that was independent of traditional concepts of legitimacy. The priests gradually assumed a more autonomous role in Persian society, serving as moral guardians of the imperial system. The military lessons of the succession crisis were perhaps the most immediately practical. The Persian army had traditionally been organized around the principle of absolute loyalty to the king, but Sogdianus's incompetent interference in military operations had demonstrated the dangers of this approach. The experience led to gradual reforms that emphasized professional competence over political loyalty, creating a more effective but potentially more independent military establishment. The economic consequences of the political disruption were severe but ultimately temporary. The Persian Empire's commercial networks were so extensive and resilient that they could survive brief periods of political instability. But the crisis had taught merchants and investors that political stability could not be taken for granted, leading to more cautious and diversified approaches to economic development. The international implications of the succession crisis were complex and far-reaching. Foreign powers had observed the Persian Empire's vulnerability during the period of internal conflict and had drawn their conclusions about the empire's strengths and weaknesses. Some had begun to develop more aggressive policies toward Persian territories, while others had sought to exploit the empire's internal divisions for their advantage. The Persian response was a more sophisticated approach to international relations that emphasized the importance of maintaining both military strength and diplomatic flexibility. The empire could no longer rely solely on its reputation for invincibility to deter potential enemies. It needed to develop more nuanced strategies for dealing with the complex web of international relationships that had emerged during the succession crisis. The historiographical treatment of Sogdianus's reign reveals the complexity of how societies deal with traumatic experiences. The official attempt to erase him from history was largely successful in the short term, but the survival of alternative accounts in private documents and oral traditions ensured that his story would eventually be rediscovered by later scholars. The tension between official silence and unofficial memory reflects broader questions about the nature of historical truth and the relationship between power and knowledge. The rediscovery of Sogdianus's story in modern times has been facilitated by advances in archaeological techniques and historical methodology. Scholars have learned to read between the lines of official sources and to piece together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources. The forgotten king's reign has gradually emerged from the shadows of history, providing valuable insights into the dynamics of political power in the ancient world. The broader lessons of Sogdianus's reign extend far beyond the specific circumstances of ancient Persia. His story illustrates universal themes about the nature of political legitimacy, the importance of competent governance, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. These lessons remain relevant for modern readers who face similar challenges in their political systems. The forgotten king's brief reign serves as a reminder that history is not just the story of great achievements, but also the record of failures and missed opportunities. Sogdianus's incompetence and cruelty created suffering for millions of people and weakened one of the ancient world's greatest empires. His story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of political ambition untempered by wisdom or compassion. But his story also demonstrates the resilience of human institutions and the ultimate triumph of competent leadership over incompetent usurpation. The Persian Empire survived his reign and emerged stronger and more sophisticated as a result of the crisis he had caused. The lessons learned from his failure influenced Persian governance for generations to come, serving as a constant reminder of the importance of responsible leadership. The physical traces of Sogdianus's reign have largely disappeared, erased by the deliberate actions of his successors and the natural processes of time. But his story survives in the fragments of evidence that escaped the systematic purges, in the institutional changes that his failure forced upon the empire, and in the collective memory of a people who learned through bitter experience that kings are human beings capable of both greatness and failure. As the stars emerge over the ruins of Persepolis, they shine down on a landscape that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the triumph and failure of kings, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Somewhere in that starlit darkness lies the buried truth of Sogdianus's reign, a truth that was deliberately obscured but never destroyed. The forgotten king's story is ultimately a meditation on the nature of memory itself, how it is created, how it is preserved, and how it is transmitted across generations. His deliberate erasure from history was a testament to the power of those who control the historical narrative, But the survival of his story in fragmentary form is a testament to the ultimate resilience of human memory and the enduring power of truth. In the end, Sogdianus achieved a form of immortality that he never sought and probably would not have wanted. His name was erased from the official records, his statues were destroyed, his coins were melted down. But his story survived as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of political authority and the importance of competent, principled leadership. In the silence that followed his erasure, one truth remained: memory, however faint, resists the grave.